I think that it's very fascinating how Chris Jericho's body fluctuates and changes from year to year. His body is never consistent looking. Actually, smash the like button if you believe Chris Jericho should have retired years ago.
Now, I feel like this move will help Chris Jericho's dying, failing career. He needs to be like MVP. I think that's a great move. This is how he can save face for the fans. Because, let's be real, the fans don't like Chris Jericho. That man has go-away heat. Nobody in The Rock means nobody wants to see Chris Jericho in 2025. The fact that last week, Conman had some nerve. This dude, he booked Chris Jericho in a 20-minute match with boring-ass Dax Harwood. I'm like, wow. So, are you trying to punish your fan base by doing that? Because we don't want to see that. We don't want to see Chris Jericho for over 20 minutes in a main event. Now, let's say that was the first match on the card. Okay, that's different. But that was your main event? Wow, 2 weeks in a row. Chris Jericho main event Collision. Wow, man, and you wonder why people don't watch Collision. That's a bad move. Nobody fucks with Chris Jericho right now as we speak. Based on the Kylie Ray shit, yeah, man, people don't like Chris Jericho. But this is how you save his career. He needs to retire, but keep him on TV, though, in terms of make Chris Jericho a manager for Big Cass. That's great booking. That's how the fans will tolerate Chris Jericho if he's a manager for Big Cass, just like MVP. But Chris Jericho has a goddamn ego. He don't want to hang it up. I'm like, bro, you gotta take a step back. This is not 2019. This is not 2020. This brand don't need you to wrestle. Okay, yes, in year one, that was great booking. When Chris Jericho became the first all-elite fake pro wrestling world champion. That makes sense based on he was the biggest name on the roster at that time. But that was 5 years ago. Times has changed. So we don't need you anymore to wrestle every fucking week. That's crazy. He needs to be like Paul Heyman and MVP. Just be a manager for Big Cass. That's how you push Big Cass. If Chris Jericho was his manager, Jericho would be a great faction leader if he did not wrestle. That's the main issue. That's why Chris has so much go-away heat. Because, bruh, we don't want to see you wrestle. So, Jericho is in his mid-50s. So, I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? You see, this is why people view all elite fake pro wrestling as low tier. Why is Chris Jericho full-time? That don't make any fucking sense. We got John fucking Cena. Fun fact, I think everybody knows Chris Jericho has been wrestling more years than John Cena. But guess who's retiring first? John fucking Cena. That's crazy. So who has more left in the tank? Is it Jericho or John Cena? I'm gonna say John. It's just John is Hollywood. So that means John, he can't go hard when he wrestles because he might get hurt and that might hurt his roles in Hollywood. So he can't go full speed right now as we speak. But if Chris Jericho wants to regain his rep, his bad rep, can you imagine a manager version of Chris Jericho? Man, that's mega heat. The crowd will respect Jericho. If he says, you know what, fuck wrestling, I just want to be a manager. I'm telling you, Chris Jericho can get back his rep. You see, Jericho can still talk. Jericho is still a great promo. So just imagine if he was the mouthpiece for Big Cass or Wardlow or somebody like that. I think that can get over. Now, has Big Cass gotten some shine since being with Chris Jericho? Yes, he has, because he is still Chris Jericho. But just imagine if Jericho was just a manager. I feel like Big Cass would be a big deal because that means he is a client of Chris Jericho. He needs to be like MVP. Just put down your fucking ego and stop wrestling. MVP has realized that, yes, he cannot wrestle every week. He is not as good as he once was. So he wants to be a manager. That makes sense. That's called being unselfish. Put over the next generation. Because I'm saying to myself, why can't Chris Jericho be like Don Callis? I think that's the best role for Chris Jericho. Be like Don Callis. Be like MVP. Listen, the learning tree is a good concept. if Jericho was just a manager and he didn't wrestle. The group is a great concept, great idea. Why not add more? Build your own stable, but don't wrestle. Nobody takes this group seriously based on Chris Jericho. The crowd loves Big Cass. The crowd respects Brian Keith. It's just they don't fuck with Chris Jericho because we don't want to see him wrestle. This is becoming Ric Flair. He's the new Ric Flair. He's the new Hulk Hogan. You are hanging around a little bit too long. This is over Ric Flair. This is over Hulk Hogan. Even Hulk Hogan did not stick around for this long. Even Ric Flair did not stick around for this long. Like, for example, MVP is not retired officially as a fake pro wrestler. He is still part-time, but he is really part-time. He rarely wrestles. That guy is a manager who spot wrestles. Not that often. That should be Chris Jericho. I'm like, your job should be put over the guys that you are managing. It's not all about you. Put over other people because you are still hogging up the spotlight away from Big Cass. That match that Chris Jericho had with Dax Harwood, that match should be a wake-up call for Chris Jericho. You got to hang it up. That match was too long, boring, botchy. Jericho looked old. I'm like, I don't want to see this version of Chris Jericho. You got to hang it up. Be a manager. Now, I'm not saying to go home, but you can stay here. Just be a manager. Be a mouthpiece for a guy like a Big Cass, a Wardlow, guys like that, guys who are held down by management. Put those guys over. It's not all about you. Nobody cares about your goddamn resume. I don't care that you are an 8-time world champion. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about Ring of Honor, okay? Nobody cares about you being a world champion for Ring of Honor. In fact, that's a low tier step down for Chris Jericho. In 2025, Chris Jericho is a world champion for Ring of Honor. Wow, how the mighty have fallen. So why did Chris Jericho resign with All Elite Fake Pro Wrestling? Because the moment Triple H became the boss of the World Wrestling Federation, that's when Chris said, you know what, hell no, I ain't going back. Because Jericho and Triple H, they got heat. So I cannot see Triple H being the boss of Chris Jericho. That's not going to happen. It will never happen. Now, if Vince McMahon was still there, hell yes, I think Jericho would have gone back. But nope, the moment Vince McMahon stepped down, that's when Chris knew, yeah, he is not welcome back in the World Wrestling Federation. Hell no. Him and Triple H do not get along. So that means that the Chris Jericho reign of terror will not end until Chris Jericho says so in All Elite Fake Pro Wrestling. And I think that's unfortunate because this guy is an egomaniac. The fact that Daniel Bryan had the smarts to say, you know what, I'm done, I gotta walk away. John Cena had the balls to say, you know what, I'm done, I gotta walk away after this year. Once again, these two men are younger than Chris Jericho. These two men started after Chris Jericho in fake pro wrestling. And the fact that those two men are younger and they said that they're retiring, they're done. Hell, even Jeff Jarrett is saying, you know what, I'm done after this year. But not Chris Jericho. How long will Chris Jericho wrestle? I'm like, this brand don't need you. Let's say Chris Jericho retires. Who should be his last opponent? I'm going to say, how about Kenny Omega? I feel like that makes sense. That would be like Shawn Michaels versus Ric Flair. I think that's the best comparison. I think Omega should be the last opponent for Chris Jericho before he retires. I mean, it's like he's tone deaf. Every time Chris Jericho does the lion salt, it looks so awful. It looks so ugly. I'm like, bro, your lion salts look like shit. Why don't you realize that? That's when you know he needs to hang it up. When his lion salts look like shit. Like I said, a prime Chris Jericho, that was his best move, was the lion salt. This version of Chris Jericho is cosplaying as Chris Jericho. This is not the real Chris Jericho. This is an imposter. He's cosplaying as a past Chris Jericho. The more Chris Jericho stays around too long, the more fans will look at The Miz as the better fake pro wrestler. The longer Chris Jericho stays around, the more fans will say AJ Styles is better than Chris Jericho. The longer he stays around, the more fans will say CM Junk is better than Chris Jericho. Moving forward, every year, every match, every month, Chris Jericho is hurting his legacy in fake pro wrestling. to a point where people will think that Chris Jericho had an overrated career without Vince McMahon pushing him. That's what people don't talk about. Chris Jericho, he ain't shit without Vince McMahon. That's what I mean. He needs to retire. Because the longer we see this washed up Chris Jericho, fans will say Chris Jericho was a product of Vince McMahon's booking. And that is facts on motherfucking facts.